The Invisible Corridors, March 1972. The humid air of the Vietnamese jungle hung thick around Firebase Alpha 7, where Marine Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Whitefeather Hathcock crouched behind his custom Winchester Model 70, watching the tree line through his unearthly scope. The small signaling mirror in his pack caught the early light filtering through the canopy, a piece of equipment that would soon become more valuable than any weapon. Captain Morrison's words still echoed in his mind from the morning briefing. 18 South Vietnamese families, 43 children, trapped in Duc Pho for 3 days, with the North Vietnamese using the hamlet as a strategic position for their supply route. 2 rescue attempts had already failed catastrophically, leaving 7 Marines dead. "They think one man with a rifle can't change the tactical situation," Morrison had said, studying Hathcock's weathered face. They're probably right. But what Morrison didn't understand, what nobody in command fully grasped, was that Hathcock had spent the previous month developing something entirely new. He called it the Jungle Trail Lift, though no manual would ever describe it. It wasn't about direct confrontation. It was about creating what he termed invisible corridors, safe passages through enemy territory by systematically eliminating key sentries while making their disappearances appear accidental. The technique demanded perfect timing, intimate knowledge of enemy patrol patterns, and shots so precise they left no ballistic evidence. More critically, it required something most snipers avoided: sustained operation deep in hostile territory, living off the land while maintaining constant surveillance. At 0400 hours, Hathcock began his approach to Duc Pho. His equipment was deliberately minimal. His rifle, 200 rounds of match-grade ammunition, basic medical supplies, and that small signaling mirror. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Create a safe evacuation route by eliminating enemy observation posts one by one, then guide the families out using hand signals and the Vietnamese phrases he'd memorized during long nights at Firebase Alpha 7. The first challenge came at dawn. Through his scope, Hathcock identified 6 enemy positions covering the main trail, each manned by 2 soldiers working in 4-hour shifts. Traditional tactics would require a full platoon to overwhelm these positions. Instead, Hathcock waited, studying the rhythm of their operations. He noted how guards moved when they ate, how they communicated with their base camp. The morning mist clung to the depression where Duc Pho sat, and somewhere beyond his sight 43 children waited in uncertainty. Hathcock adjusted his scope and settled into the patient work that would define the next week of his life. What he couldn't know was that this mission would challenge every assumption he held about warfare, about enemies, and about what it meant to carry a rifle in service of something larger than killing. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How do you measure the weight of invisible choices that no one else will ever see? His first shot came at 1347 hours. An NVA soldier leaning against a tree, apparently suffering from heat exhaustion in the oppressive March humidity, suddenly collapsed. From 800 meters, Hathcock's bullet had struck with such precision that it appeared the man had simply fainted. His partner rushed to help, abandoning his post for crucial minutes. During this window, Hathcock moved 200 meters closer to the village perimeter. The psychological effect was immediate. Enemy communications, intercepted through a captured radio, revealed growing unease. Soldiers reported strange incidents, equipment malfunctioning, sentries becoming violently ill, unexplained noises in the Vietnamese jungle that seemed to whisper through the dense undergrowth. What they didn't realize was that Hathcock was systematically targeting their most nervous personnel first, knowing their absence would destabilize the remaining guards. By the second day, the humid air carried more than just the scent of tropical vegetation. There was fear in the enemy camp, a fear Hathcock could read in the way soldiers moved, how they glanced at shadows, how they gathered in larger groups instead of maintaining proper spacing. Through his scope, he began observing the trapped families. The elderly village chief moved with careful dignity, despite the circumstances, organizing the children and adults with quiet authority. Hathcock caught glimpses of small hands clutching worn dolls, mothers holding toddlers who were too young to understand why they couldn't play outside, fathers standing protectively near doorways. The signaling mirror became his voice across the distance. 3 flashes meant stay hidden, 2 meant be ready, 1 long reflection meant hope. The village chief understood. Somehow, across the cultural and linguistic divide, across the chaos of war in Southeast Asia, 2 men began communicating through light and patience. The chief's responses were subtle. A cloth hung in a window, children moved to specific areas, adults positioned themselves where Hathcock could see them through his scope. But watching the families also complicated everything. These weren't abstract civilians in a tactical situation. They were people whose daily routines he was learning. The grandmother who always checked on the children first thing each morning. The young father who stood guard while others slept. The mother who still combed her daughter's hair each day despite their circumstances. By the 3rd day, Hathcock had eliminated 11 enemy soldiers without the NVA command recognizing they were under systematic attack. Each shot was placed with surgical precision, each target chosen to maximize psychological impact while minimizing suspicion. The enemy began reporting equipment failures, mysterious illnesses, and accidents that weren't accidents at all. More critically, he had established visual contact with the trapped families and begun the delicate work of coordinating their eventual evacuation. The signaling mirror caught the filtered Vietnamese sunlight and sent messages of hope into a situation that conventional military wisdom had declared impossible. The humid air of March 1972 carried the weight of invisible choices. What would you risk for strangers whose names you don't even know? The evacuation began at 200 hours on March 18th. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Vietnamese jungle, Hathcock used a series of predetermined light signals to guide the first group of 7 families along a route he had cleared through 3 days of careful reconnaissance. The humid air muffled their footsteps as children, some barely able to walk, were carried by adults, moving in complete silence through dense undergrowth. From his overwatch position, Hathcock provided security for families he had come to know through his scope. The grandmother who checked on children was now helping carry the youngest ones. The young father who had stood guard was now leading others through terrain he had never seen before. The mother still held her daughter's hand, even in the darkness. The most dangerous moment came when an enemy patrol stumbled upon the evacuation route. Through his scope, Hathcock could see the patrol leader raising his radio to call for reinforcement. From 400 meters, Hathcock made 3 shots in rapid succession, eliminating the patrol leader and 2 radio men before they could alert their command. The remaining soldiers, convinced they were under attack by a much larger force, retreated toward their base camp. But this moment changed something fundamental in Hathcock's understanding of his mission. As he watched the families continue their silent exodus through the Vietnamese jungle, he realized he had become something entirely different from what his training had prepared him for. He wasn't just a sniper anymore. He had transformed into a one-man psychological warfare specialist capable of creating tactical conditions that allowed non-combatants to survive in active combat zones. Rather than extracting immediately after eliminating the patrol, Hathcock made a decision that challenged every assumption about sniper operations. He spent 2 additional days shepherding families through the jungle, teaching civilians basic fieldcraft, and continuing his systematic elimination of enemy observation posts. During these days, he learned fragments of Vietnamese from the village chief. "An Toan," the old man whispered when they reached a safe point. "Safe. Come on. Thank you." The signaling mirror that had been his primary tool for long-distance communication became something more personal during these face-to-face encounters. He taught the children simple light signals, games that might save their lives if they became separated. The mirror reflected not just light, but the quiet dignity of people who had placed their trust in a stranger who spoke their language poorly, but understood their need perfectly. The final group of families reached friendly lines at 1820 hours on March 20th. Intelligence would later reveal that the NVA had abandoned their plans for the supply route, convinced that American Special Forces had infiltrated the area in significant numbers. They never realized that one Marine with extraordinary patience and unconventional thinking had rendered an entire enemy position untenable. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. When does protecting strangers transform who you thought you were? The return to Firebase Alpha 7 felt surreal after 6 days in enemy territory. The familiar sounds of American voices, radio chatter, and helicopter rotors seemed almost foreign after the profound silence Hathcock had maintained while guiding families through the Vietnamese jungle. His small signaling mirror, now scratched and dulled, remained in his breast pocket like a talisman. Captain Morrison waited in the debriefing tent, surrounded by maps and tactical reports that suddenly seemed inadequate to capture what had actually occurred. The humid March air moved sluggishly through the tent flaps as Hathcock attempted to explain his jungle trail lift technique to officers who thought in terms of body counts and territory secured. 43 children, Morrison repeated, studying the after-action reports. 18 families, 11 confirmed enemy casualties, 0 friendly losses, but the numbers felt hollow. Hathcock found himself thinking about the grandmother's careful movements as she helped carry children through the darkness, about the village chief who had understood complex tactical communications delivered through reflected light, about the young mother who had never once let go of her daughter's hand during the entire evacuation. Sergeant Tommy Bradley, Hathcock's spotter on previous missions, listened to the debrief with growing amazement and something that might have been concern. "You were alone out there for 6 days, Bradley said later, as they cleaned equipment in the evening humidity of Firebase Alpha 7, teaching civilians fieldcraft, learning their language, coordinating with their leadership. That's not exactly standard sniper protocol." "Protocol," Hathcock repeated, weighing the word. He pulled out the signaling mirror, examining its worn surface. The scratches told a story no after-action report could capture. What Bradley didn't say, what none of them could articulate, was how Hathcock's operation had challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare in Southeast Asia. Traditional tactics emphasized overwhelming firepower and rapid extraction. The jungle trail lift represented something entirely different: patient observation, precise intervention, and sustained contact with civilian populations. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the Red Cross observer who visited Firebase Alpha 7 twice monthly, arrived 3 days after Hathcock's return. During her routine interviews with personnel, she made a note in her report about the psychological impact of extended solo operations in hostile territory. "It changes them," she wrote, referring to soldiers who spent extended periods operating independently behind enemy lines. They develop different priorities, different definitions of mission success. The signaling mirror sat on Hathcock's bunk, catching occasional reflections from the tent's overhead lights. During the day, it was just scratched metal. But in his memory, it remained a tool of communication that had bridged language barriers, cultural differences, and the artificial divisions created by war. Years later, military historians would study Hathcock's jungle trail lift as an early example of precision warfare. The idea that individual soldiers with advanced skills could achieve strategic objectives previously requiring large formations. But for Hathcock, lying in his bunk in the humid Vietnamese night, the historical implications mattered less than the simple truth that sometimes the most important victories happened in silence, witnessed only by people whose names would never appear in official reports. How long can someone carry the memory of invisible choices that changed everything? The secret Hathcock carried was simpler and more profound than anyone realized. It wasn't hidden in classified reports or tactical manuals. It lived in his understanding that the enemy he had observed through his scope for 6 days possessed the same fundamental dignity he recognized in American families. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation, but through accumulated small observations that conventional military thinking couldn't accommodate. The North Vietnamese soldiers he had eliminated weren't faceless threats. They were young men who shared jokes, worried about equipment malfunctions, and showed concern for wounded comrades. The families he had evacuated weren't just civilian assets to be protected. They were people whose daily routines, family bonds, and community leadership structures mirrored communities anywhere. Dr. Vasquez recognized this transformation during her follow-up interview. Hathcock's responses to standard psychological evaluation questions revealed someone wrestling with contradictions that weren't supposed to exist in military service. "The villagers," Hathcock said slowly, turning the signaling mirror over in his hands. "They organized themselves, took care of each other. The old man who understood my signals, he was protecting those families the same way I would protect people back home." "And the enemy soldiers?" Dr. Vasquez asked. Hathcock was quiet for a long time. Through the tent walls, they could hear the routine sounds of Firebase Alpha 7, radio traffic, helicopter maintenance, soldiers talking about letters from home. "They were scared," he finally said. "When their equipment started failing, when their comrades started disappearing, they were just scared kids trying to do their job." This admission carried implications that reached far beyond individual psychology. If enemy soldiers were recognizably human, if civilian populations possessed agency and dignity regardless of political allegiance, then what did that mean for military doctrine that depended on clear distinctions between us and them? The signaling mirror had become the symbol of this moral complexity. It was simultaneously a tool of war, used to coordinate military operations that resulted in enemy casualties, and an instrument of mercy, used to communicate hope to trapped families and guide them to safety. Sergeant Bradley found Hathcock cleaning the mirror obsessively 3 weeks after the mission. "It's just equipment," Bradley said. "Standard issue survival gear." "No," Hathcock replied, "it's not." The mirror reflected more than light. It reflected the uncomfortable truth that effective warfare sometimes required recognizing the humanity of everyone involved: enemy soldiers, civilian populations, and American personnel who had to carry the weight of impossible choices. Dr. Vasquez noted in her report that Hathcock showed no signs of combat fatigue or operational stress disorder. Instead, he demonstrated what she called moral integration under extreme circumstances, the psychological process of maintaining ethical clarity while executing military missions that involved life and death decisions about people he had come to see as complex individuals rather than tactical targets. The secret wasn't hidden in classified files. It lived in the quiet recognition that the most effective military operations sometimes revealed truths that military doctrine couldn't easily accommodate. What happens when training prepares you for enemies, but experience shows you human beings instead? Years later, military historians would study Hathcock's Jungle Trail lift as an early example of precision warfare. The idea that individual soldiers with advanced skills could achieve strategic objectives previously requiring large formations. Defense Department analysts would examine his techniques for psychological operations, patient reconnaissance, and civilian population coordination. But for the 43 children who walked out of that Vietnamese jungle alive, the technical implications mattered less than a simpler truth. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is one person willing to risk everything for others, armed with skill, determination, and absolute refusal to accept the impossible. Hathcock returned to the United States in late 1972, carrying with him the signaling mirror that had become more than equipment. During his transition interviews at Camp Pendleton, California, he struggled to explain what he had learned during those 6 days in March. The mission was successful, he told the debriefing officers. All objectives were accomplished, 0 friendly casualties. What he didn't mention was how the mission had redefined his understanding of warfare itself. The families he had evacuated weren't just saved. They had taught him something about human resilience that no military training could provide. The enemy soldiers he had eliminated weren't just neutralized threats. They had shown him that fear and courage looked the same regardless of uniform or political allegiance. 20 years later, Hathcock received a letter forwarded through veterans organizations. It was written in careful English, translated from Vietnamese, signed by someone identified as the village chief's grandson. The letter included a photograph, 3 generations of a family standing in front of a small house, including children who had been toddlers during the evacuation from Duc Pho. "My grandfather kept the mirror signals you taught us," the letter said. He said they were lessons about hope that could travel across any distance. The signaling mirror sat in a place of honor in Hathcock's home, but he rarely spoke about its significance. When pressed by family members or fellow veterans, he would only say that some military operations succeeded in ways that couldn't be measured by traditional metrics. Dr. Vasquez, now retired from Red Cross service, published a paper in 1995 about the psychological impact of individual initiative during wartime. She wrote extensively about military personnel who developed innovative approaches to civilian protection, noting that these operations often produced lasting psychological benefits for all participants. They discovered that protecting others was ultimately a form of self-protection, she concluded, maintaining their own humanity while serving in circumstances designed to diminish human connection. The humid air of March 1972 was long past, but its lessons remained. Hathcock understood that the most important battles were often fought in silence, won through patience rather than firepower, measured by lives preserved rather than enemies destroyed. The small signaling mirror reflected light for nearly 40 years before Hathcock's death. According to his family, he was holding it when he passed away, still communicating hope across distances that conventional wisdom declared impossible to bridge. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What would you choose to remember? The weight of duty or the lightness of unexpected mercy?